Good morning, I'm Chris Bishop and welcome to the big story of the day in the African continent. They're calling it the business election and we'll be following it every step of the way live here on CNBC Africa. The Zimbabwe election promises to be a peaceful yet closely fought one that could make or break the country. We'll have all the issues and interviews that matter right here.
And I'm Rofiwa Madzena. Now this morning, more than 5 million registered voters will make their way to the polls from Bulawayo to Beitbridge and Harare to Mutare to cast their vote for one of 55 political parties. Now many want change after 38 years of ZANU-PF, and others feel like they should stick to what they know. Now this is the first election in Zimbabwe since its birth in 1980 without former President Robert Mugabe on that ballot sheet.
Now, on the eve of the election, Mugabe said he wasn't going to vote for the party that he founded more than half a century ago, ZANU-PF. The man was dumped out of power when tanks rolled onto the streets of Harare in November, and he appears wounded and at bay. No doubt we'll hear more from him.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's have a look at who's running. We have Emmerson Mnangagwa, the crocodile, a lawyer who fought the struggle and who has been on death row in the fight to create Zimbabwe. Mugabe recruited him to cabinet in 1980, and he has been seen as a big part of the old guard and the problems of the past. Yet now he is selling himself as an investment-friendly president.
Then Nelson Chamisa, a youngster in Zimbabwean politics, just 40 years old. Now he too has been pulling the big crowds in his campaign. He's vigorous, but maybe a little unpolished as a politician. He raised a few eyebrows early in his campaigning by promising to bring the World Cup and the Olympics and a high-speed bullet train to Zimbabwe. Nevertheless, he believes he'll be the new president of Zimbabwe by tomorrow night. But let's go to our first interview, and we are going to Lagos. And this is an African election. This is one that's going to be followed across the continent. We're going to Lagos, and our anchor there, Wole Famurewa, for discussion about how this is all going down in Lagos.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris and Rofiwa. Good morning to you. Of course, we are eagerly awaiting the outcome of these elections, and I think for two reasons. The first is to the extent that we can see an opposition topple an incumbent again in Africa. Of course, we saw that happen in 2015 in Nigeria, and over the last several months, we have seen the opposition bring together an alliance that appears to be challenging the incumbent presidency in Nigeria as well. So we'll see how this works out in Zimbabwe and the lessons that can be learned in that respect for Nigeria. Beyond that, of course, as you did mention, it is a business election. We know that the Zimbabwean economy has really been challenged for the past decade or so, and it will be interesting to see how whoever wins these elections can take that economy forward. Nigeria as well, going through a very difficult time in terms of its economy. Of course, we are just coming out of a recession, and it will be interesting to see how the elections can impact the economy long term. Of course, Bismarck Rwani, CEO of Financial Derivatives, is in the studio to give us his perspective on these elections. Bismarck, thanks so much for joining us. Yeah. I think I mentioned two reasons why I think this is important to Nigeria, but beyond that, what are your thoughts?
What's important is this morning in Lome, the ECOWAS and the Central African groups are meeting together, to discuss regional integration, common currency, and African free trade. Yeah. It's important because as the world is moving towards protectionism, there's also a move within regions to integrate and to increase free trade. Trade within African countries is only about 15%. Why do I say this? Because Zimbabwe is a critical part of the SADC. And Zimbabwe has a GDP of about $17 billion, which is maybe about, insignificant compared to Nigeria, but it plays a critical role. This election is a bellwether election to see, one, if opposition and true representative democracy can be entrenched in that part of Africa. If it happens, and it has happened seamlessly as is expected, you would see greater integration between the South African economy, Zimbabwean economy, and that area, which is very important for the new mood in Africa. So what you're going to be seeing, Nigeria is interested in having that link between the ECOWAS and southern region.
Yeah.
Nigeria is interested in ensuring that there's true representative democracy in that part of Africa as well, that oppositions can take over from incumbents. And also, it's important in terms of just generally lifting the level of confidence and Africa becoming an attractive source of investment.
Right. But beyond all that, coming back to the polls itself, as I did mention, it is a situation where we are seeing an alliance amongst opposition parties, 7 in this case. And what I think is quite interesting about these elections is that the race has become much tighter over the last 7 months. Maybe about a year ago, one would have thought it's a slam dunk for ZANU-PF, but not anymore.
Not anymore.
And what can we learn from that in terms of how things can evolve, especially in Nigeria?
In the world of social media, in the world of fast-moving information, right? They used to say 24 hours is a long time in politics. I think now 1 hour is a long time in politics, especially. There are game changers, there are transformational issues that are going to come up. I will not be surprised, because what we're missing is that you need to win handsomely to prevent a runoff.
Yeah.
I think that after this election today is going to produce a runoff. And if there's a runoff, then all bets are off.
Interesting point you're making there. Okay, so let's talk about what this means for Zimbabwe as an economy. No doubt they have gone through a really difficult time. Do you get the sense that we're turning the corner now? Or do you think this is a bit like 2015, when many people suggested that whoever wins the elections is inheriting a huge problem?
Let me put it this way. There were 3 wage increases that were announced in the last month or two. 17.5% for the civil servants, 22.5% for the army, and about 20% for the police. All of this, what we call electoral bribes, being put on the table. The currency has gone into some difficulty. It's trading about 1.35 to the dollar. You know, of course, they redenominated their currency. The Zimbabwean economy is much better off than what it was 10 years ago, but it still has significant challenges.
Right.
Now, the South African economy has just come out of a kind of a recession, and South Africa cannot really carry excess weight at this time. So it's important that Zimbabwe finds its direction and finds its feet. What is also most significant is that there's Chinese interest in both Zimbabwe and in South Africa and across Africa altogether. How much the Chinese can carry both Zimbabwe, South Africa, and other African countries at this time is a question that has to be discussed. But more important is the fact that the Chinese currency is becoming a more important currency across the world. There is competition for investment opportunities. There's the African Free Trade, African Growth and Opportunity Act in the U.S. So Africa is torn between the bipolar world, as it were, in terms of economics. But quite frankly, Zimbabwe will have to lift itself rather than being a parasite in the United States. They have GDP per capita of about $1,800 compared to South Africa, which is almost half, right? They have an unemployment rate, which is, even in South Africa, they have a very high unemployment rate. So there are a lot of challenges, and Zimbabwe, to a large extent, has been a drag recently on the South African economy. We believe that Zimbabwe should be actually a catalyst and complement the growth. So if this goes right, we will see a massive economic engine coming out of Southern Africa. That is the combined South African, Zimbabwe, and it will also affect places like Namibia, Angola, and Mozambique.
Right. So potentially that whole region can become
Absolutely.
much stronger.
And become...
But with the emergence of the Africa Common Free Trade Area,
yes.
Do you get the sense that it's now going to be increasing regional competition, or do you think it's going to be still more national in terms of the way African nations are looking to compete across the continent? Because this Common Free Trade Area is going to happen.
No, definitely. There is what we call co-opetition. You cooperate and you compete. Because competition is good for efficiency, but cooperation and regional integration makes the market bigger. So you are going to see countries going back to the basics, the source of comparative advantage. It's going to be win-win as far as I'm concerned for Africa. So there are going to be African giants, i.e. Nigeria, South Africa, East Africa, even Uganda and Ethiopia, post-conflict economies in Africa, because Zimbabwe qualifies as a post-conflict economy, post-crisis economy.
We have to get through these polls first and see how things evolve. Let's see what happens.
A few hours.
Absolutely, and we'll be tracking all of that on CNBC Africa. Of course, I've been speaking to Bismarck Rwani, the CEO of Financial Derivatives, giving his perspective on the polls today. It's back to Rufilwa and Chris in the Johannesburg studios.
Thank you very much. Wally Famarewa there in Lagos Bureau, giving us that kind of perspective on this election across the continent. Now, in the studio now, this has been talked about as the business election. And there's no business without entrepreneurs, as we all know on CNBC Africa. And in the studio, we have a young entrepreneur who's based in Harare by the name of Chad Chawanda, the CEO of Size Chunk. Chad, just a little bit of background about you, just how old you are and how long you've been an entrepreneur, and just in a nutshell what your business is.
So I'm one of those that had to, well, first and foremost, thank you very much. I'm one of those that had to decide whether to go on and get into university or get into business. So I finished O-level in 2001, and this is the peak of the collapse of Zimbabwe. So when I looked at it, I thought, should I go to university? But I could see the others that were going to university that, you know what, there could be no jobs here. So I thought, you know what, let me venture into business. So I started my first company, well, Size Chunk, in 2002. I started as a panel beating company. And over the years, I changed so many businesses. Pre-2008, I was into the FMCG. I used to supply one of the big FMCG companies, which then collapsed, called Jaggers. It was huge in Zimbabwe at that time. And I then ended venturing into mining, export of minerals. So basically, if you look at my journey as an entrepreneur, I've changed businesses, not because I wanted to change businesses, but because of the political environment, because of the economic environment. And what's happening currently in Zimbabwe when it comes to cash shortages and everything. In 2003, it happened again. That's the time around when Governor Gideon Gono came in. We didn't have money, and that time we ended up having what we called bearer checks. So similar to bond notes. So it's been a tough journey as an entrepreneur, but I always say maybe the biggest asset I have is that I actually didn't go to university, so you know that you have no fallback position. The only fallback position you have is to carry on going in business.
Question we've all got, sorry, I'm going to jump in here. Question we've all got is, how difficult is it to do business right now in 2018 in Zimbabwe?
So the challenges that we have in Zimbabwe, for instance, is that, number one, this is something that people are actually overlooking. Zimbabwe has got a serious brain drain. As an entrepreneur, I'm seeing this. And I speak to other businesses that are well established, and I ask them about the challenges that they're facing. And you realize that the biggest challenge now is brain drain. And you can't believe it because Zimbabwe is known for the highest level of literacy and everything. But the gap of those people that left is a serious gap. And if we don't build businesses that allow sustainability for the Zimbabweans that are living outside Zimbabwe to know that, you know what, if I go to Zimbabwe, I'll have a good job. Probably only a company like Econet is the one that's been able to create that. And that's one of the biggest challenges. Apart from the bond notes issue, the money issues, there hasn't been other bigger issues. Infrastructure is improving slowly, but not at the rate that we would want it to improve. And
how much of a possibility is it that you could maybe reverse that brain drain and create a conducive environment for Zimbabweans wanting to do business in the country after the kind of political dispensation that we're seeing now?
I think the environment that we need to create, first and foremost, is Zimbabweans need to believe in our country. Zimbabwe has got great potential. We need to believe in our country. I've seen the most successful businesses in Zimbabwe that I know of are actually bringing in these Zimbabweans. And guess what? Zimbabwe is a different country. You won't need as much as expatriates as other countries because we have them. The people in the diaspora have become our expatriates back at home. Everyone wants to go home, but they need sustainability.
Anyway, hold that thought there for a second. Chad Chawanda, entrepreneur based in Harare. We're going to go live to Harare now via Skype. And Ted Galante, the senior partner of Mangwana Capital. Ted, just to start off with, have you been out to vote yet?
Not quite yet, Chris. I thought I'd have a chat with you guys first. Morning, everybody. Morning, Chad. Morning, Rafiwa.
Morning, Ted.
And anyway, so just give us an idea on the ground. I mean, the build up to this election, everyone's talking about peace, everyone's talking about closely contested. What's your view on it?
Well, I think both of those things, Chris. I think certainly it is peaceful. There's absolutely no sign that I've witnessed over the last several weeks of any violence. I think people are joyous. I think whatever the outcome of this election, and I think it will be a close election, I think people are relieved to be able to go out freely and fairly and cast their vote. I think there are strong views on both sides, but I think what continues to amaze and delight me is the nature of the Zimbabwean people and their ability to have lived through tremendous adversity and now take on this challenge. I think there's just a feeling of joy that they're able to go out and have this election.
Absolutely, Ted. I mean, you speak about the fact that people are joyful on this occasion. It has been largely peaceful. People are free to go out to the polling stations. But how confident are you in the transparency and the credibility of the actual election? We haven't heard much from ZEC in terms of organization and the counting processes and the like. So how confident are you of the transparency and the actual fairness of the voting?
Look, I think that's something that we're going to have to look at over the next week or 10 days. I mean, I just want to contrast this to the emotion and to the tensions around previous elections. In this instance, President Mnangagwa has invited in the international observers, and willingly, that the hotels are full of them. We tried to go to lunch yesterday and couldn't get a lunch table because everybody's in the restaurants. A lot of foreign observers are in the restaurants. So I think that I know the Americans have some concerns. I've seen some State Department reports that report concerns. I think the British and the EU are largely confident of the freeness and fairness and transparency. But I think we'll have to see what happens over the course of the next few days. I certainly believe that this is a lot more transparent and a lot more free and fair than the elections that I've witnessed over the last 25 years in this country.
Now, Ted, I've got another question for you. I mean, clearly, with a company like Mangwana Capital, you've got your eye very much on tomorrow.
Yeah.
But basically, what I'm thinking is, you've been testing the waters out there with investment. The feeling is that if there's a credible election here, then the investors are going to come and put their money back into Zimbabwe. How far true do you think that is?
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely true. It's already happening. There are queues down at the Ministry of Lands of farmers trying to get, and by the way, I think that's going to happen around Zimbabwe's traditional strengths: mining, agriculture, tourism, financial services. There are already investors crowding the hallways of various ministries. Certainly in our business, we are fielding calls daily from people kicking the tires, not necessarily pulling the trigger yet, but very, very keen and are in various stages of doing due diligence. So I think that there's a huge amount of interest and a huge amount of goodwill, and I think that President Mnangagwa's call to get to say that they're open for business, I think he really means it, and that's on the ground. That's what we're witnessing.
Absolutely, Ted. I mean, based on some of those engagements that you've been having with potential investors, does it matter who wins the election? I mean, we do know that Emerson Mnangagwa has been part of that old regime that really brought Zimbabwe's economy to its knees. So the engagements that you're having, does it matter who wins?
Look, investors, money likes stability. Investors like stability. They like predictability. And I think that the views that I've heard expressed from various investors are that this is a Gorbachev moment. This is a de Klerk moment. The people have had a reawakening. Does it matter particularly? It only matters in the sense that there is some form of continuity. I think the donors and the DFIs will support a result as long as it's relatively transparent and free and fair. And so to that extent, no, I don't think it does matter. But I do think that Chad alluded earlier to the fact that there's been a brain drain. I think that in order to rebuild the political systems and the political structures that will encourage investment, I think perhaps the existing ruling party under President Mnangagwa has more traction. And I think that the MDC alliance, should they get in, will take a little bit more time to find their feet. So no, I don't think at the end of the day it matters, but certainly for a quick start, I think business certainly would prefer a Mnangagwa victory. I think that's certainly the feeling.
Chad, if you just hold that thought for a second in Harare, come back to Chad here in the studio. This question of infrastructure, I mean, one of the things when I first started reporting from there 20-odd years ago was that Zimbabwe had great infrastructure. Wherever we went across Africa, as soon as we got across the border to Zim, everyone said, brilliant, we've got proper roads, things work, we've got things we can buy, etc., etc. But it seems to me after, well, best part of 20 years of decline, that infrastructure is surely wearing thin. It's going to take years to build it back up again.
I think with technologies and improvement of technologies, yes, it's going to take time, but that's one of the greatest opportunities that we have, because we have a country that has got a network of infrastructure that was established already. So it's expanding on that and refurbishing. So it's different from actually starting from afresh. So I think it's a great opportunity. I look at it as an opportunity.
Let's talk about the regulatory environment when it comes to setting up businesses, growing the businesses in Zimbabwe. What has your experience been, and really what are you hoping the incoming government will do to perhaps change the landscape and make it easier?
So I'll speak of the Ministry of Mines and Minerals Marketing Corporation, because one of my businesses is exports of minerals. I had a chat with one of the guys from MMCZ, and they were telling me that, and I've also experienced it, they were telling me that there is some documentation that would take probably 30, 40 days to do. It's now just being, this is in terms of permits, this is only now happening in 3-4 days, and it's already started. So definitely there is some improvement that we are seeing, and it's based on previous history. It was a challenge. I mean, it was tough.
If we could go back live to Harare again, Ted Galante of Mangwana Capital. Another question is about Mnangagwa, how serious he is about foreign investment. I read the original Zimbabwe investment document when I was at Davos in Switzerland for the World Economic Forum. And some of the stuff there was shoddy. Some of the stuff was just laughable. I mean, they were talking about giving compensation back to farmers who had their land seized. They were talking about holding courts to work out how much. And first thing in my mind was that the Treasury is obviously very, very dry in Harare. It seemed to me a document that didn't inspire much confidence.
Well, that specific point, I think you're right. The Treasury is definitely dry. Having said that, there have been efforts underway for many years.
Hello? Ted Galante?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, still carry on, Ted. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry. So I think there have been efforts underway for a long time, collaborative efforts with the donors to fund the land, to fund compensation for the land acquisition program. So whereas I think that the government won't fund it, I certainly think that the donors are coming to the table. Now, what form that is going to take and how that compensation is going to be structured, I don't have any insight on that. But I doubt it will be direct cash payouts. but it will be some form of structured compensation. I think they're fairly close to an agreement on that now. But I think to your greater question, I think Mnangagwa was very serious about restructuring the economy. Look, our issue is a currency crisis. We have a currency crisis. We have, I think as of April, $221 million of cash in the banking system and something like $13 billion of deposits. So we've obviously got a huge liquidity crisis and a value crisis. The RTGS dollar, real-time gross settlement system dollar, is trading, at a significant discount to the real dollar. So again, we have to address that, and I think government is very seized with that. I think both parties are very seized with that issue.
Let's go back to Nigeria now, where we still have Wale and Bismarck there. Wale, let's engage on the opportunity for Nigeria to be potentially doing business with Zimbabwe after these elections, and really the key areas of creating a bilateral would be for Zimbabwe and Nigeria.
No, very interesting point. And as I mentioned earlier while we were speaking to Bismarck, the emergence of the Africa Common Free Trade Area is something that Nigeria, unfortunately, many have suggested hasn't taken very seriously up to this point. But there's no doubt that it's really an important opportunity for the economy to grow. And I think that, as Bismarck had mentioned earlier, if we can see Zimbabwe emerging as another strong economy from Southern Africa, I think then those trade ties can only increase. But let me just get some more perspective from Bismarck on the point about the build-up to the elections and the opportunity to bring some legitimacy back to the mandate of the government. As we know, over the years, there's been so much distrust in terms of the quality of the elections in Zimbabwe. But this time around, even though it's not perfect, there seems to be a lot more enthusiasm. I hear close to 6 million people have registered this time, which is like a record. 88% of registered voters are intended to vote according to a survey, and 60% of registered voters are under 40 years old. So clearly there's some enthusiasm. But your perspective on the need for legitimacy before you can really focus on turning around the economy?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to understand that this ZANU-PF was a liberation movement. Now the narrative is changing from liberating yourself from apartheid and colonialism towards managing an economy. Managing an economy means there's need for legitimacy. Legitimacy helps you come to the international community, because whether we like it or not, Zimbabwe will have to have an IMF program. We'll have to go to the international community to raise money in the Eurobond market. It has to be rated. So all of these things come with a legitimate election. That's the starting point. Having said that, for Nigeria, and the question the anchor was raising was that where are the areas of cooperation? First and foremost, Zimbabwe is landlocked. So you need the Open Skies Agreement, the African Open Skies Agreement, which is now being signed by Nigeria as well. So the bilateral health service agreements will come in. Secondly, Zimbabwe is, even though agricultural intensity is there, but it's also highly industrialized. So there's infrastructure. So there are many things that can be done. What are their products? Tobacco and some other areas. So I think that Nigeria can benefit in terms of supply, getting some supplies of manufactured goods from Zimbabwe at low cost, because the currency obviously has to be further devalued. And
then what about the potential for, if you like, skills transfer? Because I do know that over time we have seen some Zimbabwean farmers come to Nigeria. Some haven't had a great experience, but clearly it shows that the interest is there. So do you get the sense that if we do have quality polls here, a credible government in place, that we could see a lot more of that happening? I think that Zimbabwe's integration with the rest of the world, and especially in Africa, is important. You talk about high skills transfer. Zimbabwe is a country with the highest spend on education in the world as a percent of their GDP. Believe it or not, Zimbabwe has the highest spend in education. The quality of the manpower from Zimbabwe is infinitely higher than the quality of the manpower even in South Africa. Compared to Nigeria, significantly higher. So there's a lot of skill transfer, there's a lot of technology, and the leapfrogging, Zimbabwe economy is going to leapfrog
The infrastructure, I've been in Zimbabwe many years ago. The infrastructure in the real estate, the roads, the power, the rail, the tourism is unbelievable. All of that, you need just a little bit of reactivation, and then you see a jump. This economy is going to go from $17 billion GDP, which is what it is, maybe to about 20, 25, 30 in a very short period, right? The GDP per capita, which is $1,000, will go up because the population is only, the median age is 18, right? So I think that there's a lot of upside.
Right. And the earlier guest from Zimbabwe mentioned that this is potentially a de Klerk or Gorbachev moment for the current president. And let's think about that in the context of Nigeria. So in 2015, I think the outgoing president, Goodluck Jonathan, was praised for conceding defeat because of what was at stake at the time and trying to just calm the nerves of the entire country. Do you get the sense that in the build-up to the elections this time around, that there could be a significant point and an opportunity for even the current government to make such moves and concede when potentially they could be losing power?
I think that will happen. First and foremost, the Al-Shona, right? Secondly, the international community has more than a passing interest in what's happening in Zimbabwe. Mugabe himself has come out to say, well, I'd like to see, a change. So if there was a change today, it would not be as catastrophic or as violent as was predicted. It is true that the crocodile was behind most of the things that happened in the past, the ruthless political electoral machine. But those days are far gone. I think that Mnangagwa wants to be seen as a statesman, as a credible leader, and then, yes, I think that's going to happen. So, good days ahead.
Well, we'll see how it plays out. Let me throw it back to Chris. Chris, back to you then.
Thank you very much, Wally Famarewa in our Lagos bureau there. Hopefully we'll go back a bit later. But firstly, last night, President Robert Mugabe, or former President Robert Mugabe, who's not involved in this election, the first one for 38 years, he has not had his name on the ballot. He came out and he spoke to the nation. Let's hear what he had to say last night in Harare.
I can't vote, as I said, I can't vote for the party or those in power who are just now, who are the people that have brought me into this state. I can't vote for them. It's not.
I think
I can't.
I think that one is clear.
So it's the MDC, Mime Juru, Coupe, and 22 others. I'll make my thing. I have said the two women don't seem to offer very much. So what is there? I think it's just Chamisa.
Ted, you've just heard there a very emotional address by the former president. What is the feeling on the ground? Does he still have the kind of support he did from much of the country's citizens when he was president now? I mean, does what he had to say yesterday about not voting for ZANU-PF have any clout with people?
Well, I don't think Mr. Mugabe was particularly loved for much of the latter part of his tenure here. So if you ask me, I don't think being endorsed by Mr. Mugabe is exactly a political victory. So that would be my view, and I think he's largely irrelevant as a political force. That's my view.
Brilliant. Many thanks for your insights, Ted Galante. We are going to let you go vote And do enjoy the rest of the day. I'm sure the joyous feeling throughout the country will continue until those final numbers trickle in. Many thanks for your time this morning there. We've been talking to Ted Galante, who is a partner at Mangagwa. Back to you, Chad. I want to pose the same question that we just had there with Ted. This feeling of Mugabe, he just said that he's irrelevant, but in the rural parts of the country, surely he still has strong support.
I don't think so. Hey, you know, if you remember, all the people marching in Zimbabwe were marching against Mugabe. They were not supporting anyone. They were marching against Mugabe. So yes, some parts he might have, obviously in the Mashonaland, you know, because of tribalism. I know it's not supposed to be there, but there are some people that were just Mugabe loyalists, and they will just, whatever he says, they will like it. So it might get some people interested, but I don't think it has a big impact.
Well, I don't know about you, Chad. I mean, I found that very painful to watch last night live from President Mugabe talking. I first interviewed him back in '94 when he was as sharp as a knife. You know, he could have cut anybody to pieces. It was a terrible thing to see. But a bit more reaction now from across the continent. We're going to go live now to our bureau in Kigali in Rwanda to speak to Gatete Nyirinkabo, the political analyst. Gatete, what's the feeling up there about what's going on in Zimbabwe right now?
We're waiting for this with excitement. These elections are very important. For us, for Africa. Zimbabwe has been a stumbling block for Africa for a while. It's been in the news for a long time for the wrong reasons. And so this is an exciting moment because we are seeing a new Zimbabwe, the rebirth really of Zimbabwe after a long, long time of being a pariah government.
And there's one thing, Gatete, we were talking about it this morning. In some ways, there are parallels between Zimbabwe and Rwanda in the fact that both countries are facing a rebuilding from ground level, from a very, very basic level. So you think there's a bit of sympathy in Rwanda for Zimbabwe?
I'm sorry, I can't really hear you properly. Can you repeat the question?
I'm just saying that, I'll try one more time. There are parallels between Rwanda and Zimbabwe in the fact that both countries have had to build themselves up from nothing.
Yes, indeed. Well, these are parallels of all African countries that had to fight against colonialism, countries that had to fight to get independence. It's not really just a parallel between Zimbabwe and Rwanda. It's really a parallel of many African countries and some of these movements that had to fight for the liberation of the country. So indeed, these are good developments that are happening in Africa, and how what really interests me is what's happening in Zimbabwe, in Angola, in South Africa, in Ethiopia. After all, these revolutionary movements have been able, after a long time, to find change within themselves with, self-generated change, and that's quite interesting, and for the stability of these countries.
And I'm glad that you bring these other countries up. It was a point that I wanted to make about this new wave of leadership that we're seeing across the African continent. I mean, we're going to see elections in the DRC. We will be seeing elections here in South Africa next year. What exactly does this mean in terms of leadership across the country? Should we be excited about this new wave of politics and leadership that's coming in?
So there's a difference between DRC and elections in Zimbabwe, because in DRC
it looks like we're having some issues there with you, Gatete. We will bring it back to you in a moment. But let me pose that question to you in the meantime as well, Chad. Are you excited about this new wave of leadership that we're seeing across the African continent? A lot of changes. In South Africa, we called it Ramaphoria. I think in other parts it might be referred to as perhaps a new dawn. I
think, yeah. It's a new era for Africa. And I think the biggest challenge we now have, before it was colonialism, and now it's economy. You know, economy is a big challenge, and with economics you can't lie. You have to. It's it's money. You know, it's either you have it or you don't. So that's what I'm looking at, and I think it's interesting to see how Africa can grow, and with so much potential. I think the leadership in Africa should do well in order for us to reach our potential.
And speaking about young Zimbabweans, as you know, plenty of your brothers and sisters are working and living in South Africa and other countries across the continent and around the world. We're going live now to our journalist Aviwa Matila, who is down in town trying to speak to and get the reactions of a lot of those Zimbabwean expatriates. Aviwa.
Chris, I remember coming here towards the end of last year when they removed, of course, former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. The celebrations that went on, it was chaotic. People were jovial, people were happy and excited at the prospect of new leadership in Zimbabwe. Of course, now today they'll be voting in that new leadership. And one of the people, coincidentally, that I spoke to last year here was a gentleman right next to me here, who was very happy that then President Robert Mugabe was removed, but he's still here in South Africa. Sifiso Ndlovu, you've been in Yeoville for a number of years now. I'm just wondering, why aren't you joining in the voting that's happening in Zimbabwe?
I'm not joining in because I'm here in South Africa. I'm taking a look at what is happening back home there. The reason why I'm here is because I'm an activist, and my vote is very, very essential, I know, but I have to take a back seat for now, because I do believe that towards these days for voting, you saw some ballot papers, issues being found on the streets, etc., etc. ZANU-PF will never be very fair when it comes to elections. So what I'm doing is I'm watching, I'm still waiting, and hopefully that the MDC Alliance President Nelson Chamisa is going to win.
Well, you've been in South Africa for a number of years now, coming for greener pastures. And I remember talking to you towards the end of last year, and you said that the new leadership could provide that greener pastures. Do you have faith in the acting president now, Emmerson Mnangagwa, or what do you wish for?
Honestly speaking, I've been with ZANU-PF for 37 years. And the same very president who is in charge right now, he hasn't done much, especially concerning the issues that affected Zimbabweans worldwide. Zimbabweans are scattered worldwide, the reason being the economic policies that were employed at that time. They never favored Zimbabweans. Besides that, there were gross human rights violations at the same time. So I'm not having faith in ZANU-PF. All I can say is ED, that is Mnangagwa, he must take a resting seat and let the young generation lead Zimbabwe to a brighter future.
Well, that young generation includes people like you and activists like you are still out there in the streets fighting for a better Zimbabwe. But what will it take in order for the youth, and especially the bright youth that has left Zimbabwe, to go back and sort out the issues there within the country?
What I can say is Zimbabwe is loaded with the right assets, as in human assets, when they give Nelson Chamisa an opportunity to lead Zimbabwe. We've got teachers, we've got every IT specialist, we've got doctors who are scattered worldwide. What I can say is those young generations, they are right now itching to go back home to rebuild their country. All I'm saying and all I'm asking for the world is to ensure that the elections that are currently going on, they are free and fair, so that we can never see a Zimbabwe that is chasing its own kids outside its boundaries. All I'm asking for is for the Zimbabweans to give Zimbabwe another opportunity for it to be called the breadbasket of Africa.
Oh, that is Fiso Ndlovu, an activist who often speaks out for a better Zimbabwe, wanting people to go back to Zimbabwe and essentially reap the rewards of democratic and essentially a free Zimbabwe. Well, I'll be talking to a number of Zimbabweans right here in the streets of Yeovil, and I'll be interacting and giving you feedback on the sentiment from the people here that wish to be doing the voting with their fellow brethren in Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Abiwa Matila. They're down in Yeovil in central Johannesburg, talking to some of the Zimbabwe expatriate population. Chad, still in the studio. We're going to go to Kigali in a second, but don't you think it's sad? I mean, I can remember 20-odd years ago, people in Zimbabwe used to laugh about the idea of living here in South Africa because it wasn't home, they didn't like it, it was too fast. And now those same people are living here, and sadly a lot of highly qualified people doing lesser jobs because they have to. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really sad. Growing up, I remember people were laughing, Zimbabweans were laughing at Malawians, Zambians, and they would say we'd never go and live in South Africa. But here we are all over the world now, and I think people really want to go back, but like you heard from the guy in Yeovil, it's a wait and see. I've moved back to Zimbabwe in 2010 and moved back to South Africa in 2013. So it's a challenge, but I can see whatever happens is from today. I see it being positive. It doesn't matter who wins, but I think we're in a different space now.
Gateta, let's get you in back on that conversation there. The question I was posing to you before those technical difficulties was this new wave of politics that we're seeing on the African continent. Is this something we should be excited about?
Yes. In fact, there are two. Just before I went, you left. While we left it, you were asking me between elections in DRC and elections in Zimbabwe. And the major difference between these two countries is that in the DRC there's no strong political party that is entrenched in society and that has been there for a while. And that, so politics in the DRC is not as developed as it is in Zimbabwe. And that's the difference, because these political parties like the ZANU-PF, in fact, tend to be a stabilizing factor within these times of elections. Like in countries like DRC, where you don't have a strong party like that, where you have parties that are created from several pieces only for the purposes of elections, you can't predict stability. And that's where basically you have stability risks. However, in countries like Zimbabwe, where you have these movements that have been able actually to change their champions within themselves, I think this is the only way they could maintain themselves into power. The initial leaders, the historical leaders, had become liabilities to them, and now they've been able to change their the champion, the avatar, the person that they front, and this, I think, is a good thing for both for the stability of the country, but also for the maintenance of these historical political parties in politics in their countries.
Got it in Ngabo, up there in Kigali. We're now going to reach out further across the continent. We're going back to Lagos and Olifa Marewa and Bismarck Rewani for final comments.
Yes, absolutely. And Bismarck, as we get your final comments, just want you to reflect on the point that has also been discussed today, the brain drain that Zimbabwe has suffered. I'm sure Africa has had its fair share across the various countries, but it does appear that Zimbabwe really has really borne a huge part of that. Your perspective on how an election can help to change that?
Well, again, it comes back to the whole question of legitimacy, the economy itself, and the changing landscape. All of these things point to the fact that Zimbabwe has been punching way below its weight. The potential GDP growth rate in Zimbabwe is far higher than its actual GDP growth rate. Its currency is shamble, the inflation, so many things. If you press the reset button, you're going to have a massive inflow of Zimbabweans coming back again and to drive it. And that, again, will be another catalyst for actually propelling growth in the right direction. So it's win-win for Zimbabwe.
I guess it's still fingers crossed in terms of what the President Mnangagwa can deliver if he were to get a ticket right now. But from all that he has said and what the opposition has said, and if you look at the quality of the polls, the build-up to the polls up to this point, one does get the sense that you're going to get a better deal than you've had over the last few decades. So how significant is that, and what are your expectations for Zimbabwe after these polls?
First and foremost, I think there will be a runoff, which will even make the legitimacy better, right? Both parties are talking about reform, so we're on the same page. It's a question of the credibility of ZANU-PF versus the credibility of the opposition. There's the age factor. So this guy is 75, the other guy is 40. Yeah. So he's more appealing. In a runoff, the 40-year-old guy is going to be more appealing. He's a priest, so he's used to the pulpit and preaching. So everything points to the fact that we might be seeing something totally different. But whatever it is, ZANU-PF or the opposition, Zimbabwe is going to be much better off after this election.